Okay, welcome to the Sacred Life. We're going to have a little different sort of conversation today because David and I couldn't really get together. We like to get together for a walk in the woods, and I'm just out in my backyard right now, standing on the edge of a baseball field, and David's horseback riding. So you might hear some crunching of leather. There you go. I just heard a little bit of it come through, but it sounds like this will be able to work for the conversation. And even though we're not doing our normal thing, I actually want to make a quick comment about our normal thing, the idea that we go walking in the woods. Mostly today's conversation is going to be a supplement to what we did last time when we were referring sort of mostly to the mark of the beast. But when I say what we normally do, we go for a walk in the woods, and in my mind that's sort of an act of exploration. Even though it's stuff that we've seen, we've been in that woods before, we're choosing the path while we're out there walking. We don't have a script that we're following. We are in our speech, in the dialogue that we're doing, we're also in a process of exploration. And to me that fits in very well with the ideas that we've been talking about too. That we're not coming at it from a dogmatic, here's what we believe kind of thing. We're just hitting record on a conversation and seeing what happens, seeing what we stumble into accidentally. And last time when we talked, I think it was, from my perspective anyways, from what I hope we accomplish, it was one of the better talks that we've had. But one thing that I particularly enjoyed, I'm going to mention one thing that I said, and then we'll get to something that David said as well. But I kind of made a comment about the problem with logical argument, the problem with rationality, which I'm not opposed to. Rationality is great. Reason is great and very, very useful. But when we lean on these things, we sort of act like we can put all our trust in them and they can take care of all of our problems. Then I think we're in error. But in my mind, I've been trying to solve this problem. Like I feel like there's something wrong with the logical process, as powerful and as good as it is. The logical process being basically, and I'm going to chat a long time, David, before I give you a chance to talk, I think.
That's okay, my horse is getting bored in there.
Okay.
Snorting.
Yeah. But the logical process basically is you have a premise and you combine it with another premise, and those two things allow you to come to a conclusion. And there are lots of ways that we can do that poorly. So we might have a premise that is just no good. We might think that combining them leads to the conclusion, but we're actually making some kind of logical leap. There's lots of errors. Other logical fallacies too, but there's lots of errors we can have in the process of what we think is logical thinking, where we're not thinking logically, but we believe that we are. But I thought that's not the issue. The problem with logic is not that we do it poorly. I think there's another issue with the logical process. And then in the last conversation, we'd spent a lot of time talking about a closed interpretation of a symbol. But I stuck that into this logical process and thought about, well, what if we have a closed interpretation of a premise? And this is just something that I said last time, but if we have a premise, what we're doing is we're interpreting an idea in one way, and we're ignoring all the other things that idea can mean, that truth can mean. We're turning an idea into something that's crisp, that has crisp edges, that doesn't have blurry boundaries. And once we do that, we turn this truth into an object that we can use like a building block to lead to other conclusions. And again, it's really powerful, but the problem is you cut off the blurry edges, you cut off the alternate meanings of the idea. So now when you combine it with other ideas, it's not going to get you... it's going to get you to a good conclusion, but a flawed conclusion. And it's always going to lead you to a conclusion that has some sorts of flaw, something that it ignores that will be important at some point in time to somebody. And actually, this seems kind of closely related to the idea of concern with the margin in society, concern with people that aren't normal, or ideas that aren't normal, or institutions that aren't normal. that don't fit in the center of things, but that fit on the margins, because sometimes our rational processes just cut those off and exclude those, and we come to good and powerful conclusions, except for the fact that now we have a group of people that's not represented by them. That wasn't the point I was making, but that sort of fits in with this problem with the nature of logic. I don't know if that's an interesting or persuasive perspective to other people, but for me, I'd been trying to figure out what is wrong with logic itself. And again, not to reject it, but to say, I think it's a good thing, but I think it has a weakness, and I can't figure it out. I don't think the weakness is that we do it wrong. I think there's something wrong with logic itself. And I just felt like during that conversation, because it was an act of exploration, I was able to land on this idea that was, for me, a solution to a kind of intellectual problem. And so I was just really pleased with that. And I wanted to, for one, I want to highlight the critique of logic again for anybody who would be interested. But also I wanted to highlight this idea of you don't come to something like that through like this purely rational process, but you come to it through this more dialectical process, this dialogue, this back and forth, this like throwing ideas out there and seeing what happens in I think a not entirely rational way, which is the kind of conversation that we have when we're on a walk in the woods. So that was one thing. The other thing I can get around to too, but I don't know if David, if you wanted to make any comments about either the critique of logic or about the process of exploration.
I'm curious what you said. I guess I don't quite know where you're going with it. That there's something flawed with logic itself.
Well, just that in order to use an idea as a premise, you have to turn that idea into something simpler than what it really is.
Yeah.
If you're going to, like we talked about, it was in the context of this conversation about problems with categories, problems with categorizing people in particular. But when you put something into a category, then like you're putting a sort of strict definition on it, and you're saying it is this thing. And I mean, I guess I need to use an example in order to make the point. If you try to say that a person is a certain thing, then you're ignoring other things that person is. So, for example, race. Like if you're going to define, or we keep saying that we're Swiss, for example. The truth is we're not Swiss. The truth is we're a mixture of a whole lot of different nationalities, and in fact, like people that are living in Switzerland are a mixture of a whole lot of different nationalities as well. And so you try to put somebody in like a racial category or ethnic or national category, there is a truth to that. There's a truth to saying that we're Swiss, but it also ignores a lot of other truths. And so if you want to use something as a premise so that you can come to conclusions, what you have to do with an idea or with something that you put into a category is you have to ignore all those blurry lines that surround it. And you just have to say, it is this thing. This person is this thing, or this idea is this thing. And now I've simplified it and made it into something that it is not. And it's a useful thing, but it's not actually what the thing is. I don't know if that cleared it up or not.
Yeah.
And so, like, in order to have a premise, you have to start off by telling a kind of a lie. Again, you take an idea and you turn it into something simpler than its own reality. That's a kind of a lie, and it's useful. Again, logic is really, really useful.
Yeah, I mean, my immediate reaction to what you're saying is, John, how postmodern are you?
No, I know, and I sort of feel that, and even when I mention like the center and the margins, it's like I'm referencing other people's arguments that when people get like really bent out of shape about the exclusion of the margins and then try to lift up the margins as a result, like the people that are in the margins of society, that's what I mean, then I feel like there's a kind of affront to the center, but there's sort of an affront to like, wait, so like for example, an affront to the center. You could speak of that in moral terms, but you could also say like, well, that means if you're attacking the center, then you're attacking straight white Protestant men. in order to lift up some minority that has been excluded from the thought process. And so, I mean, that's not only postmodern, but that's also woke, you know, which is kind of even worse than postmodern. So no, I mean, I think that's right what you're saying, and that's why I'm so cautious to say I don't want to indicate that I'm trying to reject logic and reason, which postmodern thinking does want to reject those things, and often wants to reject them because they're so associated with the center, and logic and reason are so associated with masculinity also, and with the patriarchy. And I'm not putting myself in the camp that makes those criticisms, and above all, and the way that I try to say that I'm not in that camp is because I'm saying I like logic, and I want to elevate logic and reason, and get people to embrace that. But I also think that it's insufficient. The way that I think it's mostly insufficient is because logic doesn't tell you how to live your life or why to live it that way. It doesn't tell you what's valuable and what you should pursue and how to pursue it. In order to land on those things, you have to rely on something other than logic. So for me, that's the real problem with logic, is that it doesn't have all the answers. And I guess that's related to this issue. I thought there are people who try to come up with a logical way of explaining morality. They say just through logical means and through rational means, we should be able to come up with a system of morality that everybody can agree to. And, Sam Harris, I'm not really that familiar with his thinking, but I know that's sort of his project, to come up with a totally rational morality. And from my perspective, I say it can't be done. Whatever you come up with as a logical conclusion and say, well, look, this is how people should live in order to be moral people. I think anybody who wants to can say, you know what, I would rather kill a bunch of people and seize power, and I don't care about your system. I don't think it has any binding on anybody, even though one person has decided that it's logical. So that, I think, is the real breakdown of logic, is that it doesn't give you the ultimate answers to the ultimate questions in life. It never has, and it never will. But like I said, along with that, I felt like there is a weakness in the process. There's something about logic itself that makes it so that it can't come to those kind of conclusions, because those are decisions that depend on dealing with the blurry areas in life. Questions of what's the meaning of life and all of that. You can't come up with crystallized definitions and plug them into a system and come up with an answer to a question like what's the meaning of life, or what should I do with my own life.
Yeah, this is all pretty interesting. I was just listening at work today to what's his name, Saint Isaac the Syrian. I looked him up while you were talking. Would have been I didn't know who he was. It just was something that came up.
Mm-hmm.
When I was listening to this, after I would listen to something else. I guess he's a 7th century Syriac theologian. But he was talking about this idea of the intellect and knowledge, and coming down really harshly on this idea. Well, he presented some really interesting ideas. What it was like a collection of short sayings. I guess he probably wrote them as a collection. That was a pretty common thing for ancient Christians to write catalogs of really short proverb-like sayings.
Yeah.
Generally, they're longer than the Proverbs in the book of Proverbs, but anyway, he's talking an awful lot about these ideas of knowledge and of logic and reason, and I can't remember off the top of my head. I guess I wasn't prepared for this to come into this conversation, and also I'm riding a horse, so I don't have any notes or anything.
Yeah.
But he's making comments about, the intellect is useful, but it's only useful to help you learn how to pray. And then after you've learned how to pray, the intellect ceases to be useful.
Yeah.
Which I thought was just a really fascinating idea. It's important to point out his idea of pray is considerably different than what a modern idea of prayer
Mhm.
would be.
Yeah.
But and then like, but it does like it really does, if you break it down, relate an awful lot to what you're saying. That is essentially
Right.
what he's saying in this sort of 7th century Eastern Christian, Oriental Christian way of framing things, is that, like, basically what you said, like, you can't, like, intellect can get you on the right path. It can point you towards something.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately it can't actually get you it can't attain to higher things.
Yeah.
It's just, and like he also speaks of the intellect considerably as extensively, I mean, as a carnal thing, an earthly thing, and something like, not something that's heavenly.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's like a tool in a way. I mean, in a way,
Yeah.
it's not your own self, but it's a tool that you can use.
Right. Yeah, and then like on that topic, like he also talked about like, people who are, really eager to share their intellect and share their knowledge of the truth don't actually know the truth, because those that do know the truth keep it in humility.
Mm-hmm.
Which
Yeah,
I just
that's
thought, like,
I mean, like Jesus didn't write anything, and,
right. And
but also Buddha didn't
like,
write anything, and Confucius didn't write anything, and I mean that is a really interesting pattern. And Socrates didn't write anything, so it's like really something quite striking that these people who have a perspective and a wisdom that changes the world, and thousands of years can go by, and we're still talking about these people, and we're still trying to draw on them rather than on the people who have come since then. And they didn't write anything. I mean, it is interesting.
Yeah, man, and like also Jesus' disciples, 2 of them wrote something,
Mm-hmm.
and the conventional wisdom around that is the only reason they wrote anything is because people begged them to.
Yeah.
It's like you have Peter write some things, and you have Matthew writes a gospel, and that's it.
Well, you get John.
Oh yeah, sorry. So 3 of them wrote something.
Well, you get James.
Well, he wasn't one of the disciples. He wasn't one of the 12.
Okay, that's well, anyways. Okay, so yeah, I mean your comment about his take on the intellect is interesting for a lot of different reasons. The intellect, I described it as being like a tool, but you could kind of associate it with like the conscious mind, and then this other type of thinking, you might say like that's the unconscious mind. And so you said the intellect, or this writer that you were quoting said the intellect could help you figure out how to pray, but then it wasn't going to do you any good. And I think there's this amazing thing about the way that consciousness works, because I will say, for a time when I was like especially in college and beginning to learn about psychology, then it sort of felt like the subconscious is a real mystery, and then when it came to like neurochemistry, it seemed like this very mechanical view of the person, and I really didn't even want to know very much about it, because I felt like it sort of denied some of the mystery and maybe sacredness of being human. But so I did learn about these things, and really actually not very much at college when it comes to neurochemistry. But I took an interest in these things, and I kind of came to a point in life where it's like, well, hey, if there's something that I was afraid of for some reason, then I'm going to go out and learn about it now. There was a time in life when I felt like I couldn't handle it, and I don't want to be that way anymore. So I'm going to go out and learn about these things. So it's like the more you learn about this, the more you realize that like what you do subconsciously, the decisions that you make without thinking about it are actually like they make perfect sense. And you can think of your body as being like a machine, and it just runs its program. And I know this is why I said I didn't like to think about this stuff, because I don't want to think about a person as being like a machine. But in a way, you operate according to like a very strict program. And when you have something that you're doing, say like you're playing a video game or something, and you think, okay, I'm just going to do 5 more minutes or 1 more round or whatever, and then I'm going to quit. But then that amount of time passes, and then you don't quit, you're just back into it. And it's like, well, the reason, dopamine is the reason for that, because a dopamine release makes it easier for you to do something again, and it's how you form addictions. Basically, like, it is easier for you to keep playing that game than it is for you to do anything else. It's easier for you to continue than it is for you to stop, and because that's like the path of least resistance, you continue to do it. And so all your habits, basically they work that way. You've given yourself a reward for doing something, and then you developed it as a habit, and now you just do it automatically. All your routines, everything you do in the morning when you get up, like they're things that you basically automatically do without very much conscious input at all. And sometimes you can wind up in just a disastrous state of life, and you've got lots of bad habits. And when you're in that state, then the thing that can really actually be a mystery is your conscious mind and is your rational mind, because somehow it's like you've determined what kind of person you're going to be, and your program is written, and you cannot help but be that kind of person. But then you can step back and observe it, and you can say, this isn't rational. You can say, I have a goal to be this kind of person, and I'm being this kind of person in myself. Instead, I'm ruining my chances at a good life. I'm hurting myself every single day by doing things that aren't important to me. And then you make a rational decision, and a conscious, well thought out decision that says, I'm going to change my life. And I think that decision is not only rational, but but the conscious mind comes in and makes an evaluation and says, this does not help me to achieve my goals. And then you have the ability to rewrite your own programming. But once you've done the rewriting, then I don't know what to say. Then you're on the path. So that's what I thought of when you said the intellect helps you to learn how to pray. But afterward, it's not the intellect that's going to be like the thing of true prayer.
Yeah, but it's also not the dopamine response or the animal nature either. And I guess to cast this in a Christian, sort of a Christian context, is this harkens back, this points back to the traditional model that you're a triune being. Your 3 beings united in one.
Mm-hmm.
Distinct but inseparable. You are your intellect is part of you. Early Christianity quickly associates the idea of the soul with the intellect, the rational mind.
Well, it's like I said, I think this is going to be kind of to your point. I don't think it's the intellect alone that can make that transformation, because I think you can logically look at your life and say, I'm living a bad life, and yet you find you are still powerless to change it.
Yeah. Right.
And so you've got this programming that's doing one thing, you've got this intellect that is failing to change that thing, but then somehow there's this third force, which maybe you could just define as some different layer of the subconscious or something, but there's something else at work too that is necessary, and I'm not going to try to define it. I'll let you do that, I guess.
I'm not going to try to define it either. When you start getting into things like what's your body, what's your spirit, what's your soul,
mm-hmm.
You can't it's not something I think you can really hammer down.
Yeah, right.
And I'll go along with that. you read the writings again, like of early Christians, and they harshly criticize those Christians that try to define what they are,
Mm-hmm.
and like in their minds, like that's the kind of error that leads you to become a Gnostic.
Yeah. Well, go ahead and finish your point on this, like tripartite being.
Yeah, well, well, I've kind of forgotten it because you interrupted me.
Okay, all right.
But no, just that. So, like, I was making the point that, well, mostly I wanted it to get into the point that, so traditionally Christianity identifies that what humanity has, what humans have that sets us apart from the animals, from the beasts, is the rational soul, like the rational intellect, the rational mind,
Right.
our ability to reason and to use logic.
Right.
And so they quickly take this and say, well, like that must be for a reason, and maybe that reason is it's something that allows us to point towards God in a way that the animals can't.
Mm-hmm.
We can look at the world and see things and discern things about it and do things, and that gives us the ability to approach God in the way that the animals can't. So, like, even though we've criticized, this intellectual, rationalistic approach, it's still a part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
And
No,
guess
I think it's a very important part of the process, and
Yeah.
I've tried to refrain from allowing us to be dismissive of it.
Right. Yeah, and like that's the thing I think that sets us apart from, like, let's say Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
Which is like Buddhism is like, if you're going to be a good Buddhist, it's the complete draining of the rational intellect.
Right. Well, and I keep mentioning the Romantic poets as well, and there are some ways where they can be actually very rational, like they can be very moralistic in particular, but Romanticism too winds up basically being a rejection of rationality, because they've seen rationality run amok. They're people who were reacting against the Enlightenment and the sins of the Enlightenment, and they had this sort of extreme reaction. And while there are things that I admire in them, I also have this feeling that, like, man, Romanticism sort of like ruined the whole course of human history, because, I've mentioned before, like this distinction between the Romantic idea and the classical idea. Classical, using the very broadest possible sense of that word, in terms of art. In Romantic art, and I know I'm going on a little bit of a tangent. In Romantic art, the art is all about basically yourself and your feelings. And you want to elevate your feelings and view your own feelings as being kind of something that's sacred. And in classical art, your aim is instead to, through the experience of that art, to bring proper order to your soul. And also to your body, actually, both of those things. But it's like in rejecting reason and trying to return to something that was better than pure reason, they didn't get there. Like, they didn't wind up with a whole person when they were trying to, like, fix the problems of the Enlightenment. And so that's what I don't want to do. I don't want to reject reason and wind up with this half of a person.
Well, and it's like it's sort of something that is like being repeated now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and that's I think also like part of this, even though we talk about like mysticism as being something that's important to embrace, that's sort of like a danger of mysticism as well. That's like, yes, you're trying to reclaim something that's valuable and that we've lost, but in the process, like you're just becoming the other half of a person. You're not becoming a whole person if all that you value is the mystical side of life.
Right.
And I mean, that's, I think mysticism is in some ways like the best way to describe the thing that we're talking about. And yet when I hear people using that word mysticism, then what I see is like is just a different half of a person that's missing something important.
I think that's a really good way to put it, because we've in a number of times had this conversation, like, we kind of don't like the word mysticism because of the connotations it has.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And like, well, that's, I think, a good summary of what those connotations are. It's
yeah.
like, well,
right.
Mysticism is like this. Sorry, I'm making some noise here.
Yeah.
It's like this like complete lack of reason and intellect. Well, that's not actually the sort of mysticism that we're after.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
Like, that is like this pseudo mysticism that's crept up. Oh, I'm gonna keep making noise. Sorry.
Yeah. Let's see. I had another direction with your intellect as being this thing that leads us to prayer, and I don't know if I can come up with it or not. But no, I'm lost. I thought since you're making so much noise, I'd come up with something to talk about. But do you have another thought? Because I wanted to bring in one other thing from our last conversation, and I think I can tie it pretty well to where we're at right now.
Well, I guess just kind of tie that up, that really does bring in what we're trying to get at with mysticism, that it's not like this mindlessness,
mm-hmm.
this lack of intellect. It's like, no, our sort of mysticism is this traditional Christian mysticism in which the rational intellect is the starting point.
Right. I guess my only other thought, sorry, I got it again, this thing of the intellect being what leads us to prayer. It's sort of kind of goes along the same idea that that the intellect is not going to tell you what is valuable in life. The point that I made before, I felt like when you made that comment, it was sort of echoing that place that I started. The intellect or logic or reason is not going to tell you what's valuable in life and what kind of person you should be. There's something else that's the source of those things, but you can't achieve those things without the intellect. Once you know what kind of person you need to be, then like it's sort of like your obligation then is to step back and take a good hard look at yourself and rationally analyze, like, what am I doing in my life? Is this going to get me the results that I know deep in my heart and soul that I want?
Well, like, it's fascinating because, like, when you say that, I have to think of like the rational atheist,
mm-hmm.
who is just like, well, the intellect is everything, and the answer, like you mentioned Sam Harris, like the answer is let's come up with a perfectly reasonable system. Like, we don't have any need for mysticism. We don't have any need for religion. We don't have any need for philosophy. We don't have any need for superstition and all of this hocus pocus nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like they fail to realize how much that's actually so wholly embedded in their being, and that no matter what, they can't actually get away from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, even the quest for like a moral, and I'll even go ahead and use the word ethical, like the quest for an ethical world. Like, why? What's the point? Why should why should we value that?
This is something that troubled me a lot when I was younger. Is looking at this idea of rationalism and intellect and reason is like, well, you know what? If you're actually going to be rational and reasonable about things, the world's going to be a terrible place because you're going to kill everyone.
Yeah, right. Which, I mean, that's what a point I've tried to make is that is what rational thought does. If it's left to its own devices, it comes across those who disagree with it, even though they might be equally rational. They just define those premises in a different way. They cut off a different part of the axiomatic idea than what you cut off. So now that you find out you come across somebody who has different conclusions than you, then you try to destroy. And actually, I mean, that is what you see from a rational atheist too. They not only like dislike religion, they want it wiped off the face of the earth.
Yeah, but like that's to me like the troubling question of the intellect is, why does a human life matter?
Right.
Like why is it? Why
Well,
is
and it doesn't. I mean, from the rational perspective, it doesn't. And you can see like that's why that's like you can rationalize genocide. It's your heart that tells you that it is wrong.
Yeah, right.
But you can come up with reasons. You can say, hey, we can have a better nation if we adopt eugenics programs, because we'll get rid of the inferior people and we'll have the superior people. And from a rational standpoint, it does make perfect sense. It is perfectly acceptable. And from from a non-rational standpoint, like it's the non-rational part of you that says, no, you cannot destroy the undesirable people.
Yeah. Well, it's like, well, why not?
Yeah, you just can't. I mean, that's the only way the non-rational side can respond is just to say you just can't. It's just wrong. But as far as like giving rational reasons, I think it can't be done.
Like to be fair, there is an answer to that question. So it's like, why can't you do it? Well, it's like, well, because here's what the consequences are. That's why you can't do it. But that actually just pushes the question back another round. It's like, okay, so why are those consequences?
Yeah, well, even then, it's like, okay, so now all we have to do is figure out a way to avoid those consequences, and then it will be ethical.
Right. Yeah, but like I'm speaking of consequences as in like, well, no, never mind. That doesn't really make a difference to your argument. Or to your point, rather.
Right.
I don't want to.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean,
arguing against you.
Right. No, I mean, the whole debate is like it just is kind of a disaster, but it shows off the danger of making reason God. You know, I mean, like making or making that the chief element of your humanity, because reason is going to commit genocide and it's going to create eugenics programs.
Right. I mean, and it has.
Mm-hmm.
Like, let's not just say it's going to. Let's just say it has.
Yeah. Right.
Many times it has.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, like, and it's a driving force in like all the divisions within Christianity that wind up marring the faith so much. You know, and we've talked about like there can be good in division, in different traditions, but there can also be a lot of bad in the way that those different traditions exercise hostility toward one another.
Right.
But you know, it's like rationalists and dogmatists, the people who have all the answers that decide, well, everybody else must be going to hell, and so they start preaching that to the world.
Right.
But it's, you know, and I maybe I've mentioned this before, but I was struck by a comment Joseph Campbell made that when and he was referring to a specific event, which I can't recall, but it was some sort of like, I don't know if I want to use the word ecumenical because we use that just within a Christian context, but we bring these people from different religious traditions all over the world together, and the priests, the preachers, the rational people cannot find any common ground with one another, and the mystics find a kind of brotherhood, even across religious traditions.
Right.
So again, it's like the people that, and you know, I don't want to come across as saying like, well, you know, that means we're all really one religion deep down inside. That does show off like some of the strength in mysticism. Maybe it shows off some of the weakness in it too, but it certainly shows off some of the strength in it. And it shows off some of the.
I'll interject there, like, just to say strength and weakness. It's like every strength is also a weakness.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Like which is like a fundamental mystical idea, but it's like it's a universal pattern. It's a universal truth.
Yeah.
Your greatest strength is your greatest weakness.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like Achilles.
Yeah, his tendon was his greatest strength.
Well, no, I mean the fact that, like, you know, he's dipped in the river and held by his ankles, like that's the myth.
Mm-hmm, right.
So like this basically makes him invulnerable, but like in fact he has a vulnerability, and it's just like his invulnerableness makes him vulnerable.
Yeah.
In a sense.
Right.
So it's like you're like there is a strength. I'm sure that's a better example. It's just the first one that came to the top of my head. That anything that's a strength is also a weakness, and anything that's a weakness is also a strength.
Yeah. Well, I mean, also like Siegfried or Siegfried in the Nibelungenlied has the same story. Basically, he bathed in dragon's blood, but there was a leaf on his back, so it didn't cover one spot. But his invulnerability, his excellence, part of what it does is it makes him a target.
Right.
If he'd have been a normal guy, nobody would have wanted to stab him in the back.
Right. Anyway, yeah, I guess getting back this conversation, I guess turned into like a
No, I mean that's
mysticism.
right. Well, I mean I started off with this this sort of critique of logic, so maybe it was destined to go that way. But I did say I wanted to bring it back to one other point that we made in our last conversation. And I said this would sort of be a supplement to our last conversation. I don't know how much that has wound up being true, but I'm at least mentioning two different things that we said. At the very end of that talk, I should just be saying you mentioned that it was not the righteous who judged the whore of Babylon. The righteous came out, and the wicked are the ones who are doing the judging. And in the context of our last conversation, which was all about institutions and systems and all of these things, then sort of the point that you were getting at there was when institutions are flawed, and they will be, then it is not the place of the righteous man to just call out condemnation and try to destroy the thing.
Yeah, right.
And it's a point I've been thinking about quite a bit since we had that conversation, because really the fact that systems are bad, I mean, just to say it very simply, is blatantly true. When you have systems, there are problems that come in. There's corruption, for one thing, that is there's a level of corruption that's not possible unless there's a system. Maybe there's no such thing as corruption at all unless there's a system. So there's that issue of corruption, but there's also this sense that when you have an institution, when you have a system, then it will kind of become rigid and rational, because an institution or a system cannot be spiritual and mystical just by the very nature of what a system is. So over time, it becomes crusty and rigid, and I mean, I could just go ahead and use the word conservative, which I don't want to use that as an insult in general language, but along with that, an old institution, it has these conservative tendencies that kind of make it stifle any form of creativity and new growth and new life. So there are ways that institutions are bad, and anybody who's a part of some institution, you work for a big company, you work for, I'll just say a school, since that's where I'm working right now, and I certainly have frustrations with the very fact of being part of an institution. I was self-employed before, and I preferred that to being part of an institution. But anyway, so there's something that's just seems very obvious about the fact that institutions have problems because they are institutions. Systems have problems because they are systems. But the righteous person isn't somebody who says, well, therefore I hate the institution and I'm going to seek to destroy it. In fact, when the righteous person becomes an old man, then he starts thinking, how am I going to leave my legacy? How am I going to do something that's valuable to generations that will come after me? And in order to do that, he turns to institutions. He tries to enrich them so that institution can continue to bless people in the future. And it's like the very thing that we're saying is the mark of the beast is also something that a righteous man has the power to transform and make it a vehicle for good, and maybe I should say restore it as a vehicle for good. And that's, I'm talking about the righteous man as an old man, but also as a young man or young woman or whatever. When you're part of the system, you're not raging against it. Your goal is to make this as good as it possibly can be.
Yeah, and that actually kind of goes back to the book of Revelations. What's the image you have in Revelations? is like you have the idea of the New Jerusalem, like this New Jerusalem coming down. Like you think, what is the New Jerusalem? It's like a symbol of the institution.
Yeah, right.
And then there's this idea like, okay, so you have to understand that the book of Revelations is kind of the book of Genesis in reverse.
Yeah.
Like I really like to think of it that way. So like you have the exact same pattern. You have this pattern in the book of Genesis laid out, and then in the book of Revelations you take that same pattern and flip it around. So what you have in Genesis is this idea that everything that is an institution or a technology is the invention of Cain or his sons.
Yeah, and cities themselves, which you're mentioning, New Jerusalem, the city.
Cain himself built the first
right,
city.
yeah.
Just like, and like the reasoning for Cain building a city is like, well, the world is terrible and everybody wants to kill me, so I'm going to build this city where people like me can get together and like be wicked together, so that we can oppress the world, basically.
Yeah, I mean, and that's
we can exert ourselves upon the world.
I want to make the point that the text doesn't say that. I mean, you're reading into it based on the nature of who Cain is and the nature of what a city is. But right, yeah, I do agree with you.
I mean, that is a good thing to point out. So yeah, you have this notion, but then like you have it in Revelations. It's like, well, you know what? We're going to take all of these things of Cain, and we're going to turn them around and redeem them, make them good. Because it's like, as it turns out, even though Cain was evil, he still can't create something that's outside of God.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and so in Revelation, again, I was kind of hard on cities in a way. I mean, I made a comment that that people who live in cities have spiritual needs that people who live in the country don't have, which I don't know if urban people feel that way, but I think every person in the country feels that way. And especially if you're in my situation where you grew up in the country and now you live in a city, then you feel like you don't necessarily feel like I hate this. You might feel that way, but you at least feel like well, I got to pay a ransom for my soul. I mean, that to use the language of the last conversation, like I need to make sure, I need to be very careful that I'm setting things right, because there is something that's wrong about being here. I mean, there is something that like the system of the city takes something good out of you. So, yeah, well, but even though I was coming down hard on cities, it's true that like in Revelation, or just generally with like I mean, I think you get also some like some Old Testament images of this restored city, but you get the redemption.
Yeah.
The redemption of this city. And yeah, I mean, that's nice to bring up in terms of what I had just said as well, because it's like in the course of our lives, we are also working out the redemption of these systems.
Right. Yeah, and it's like there's something I'm coming to appreciate and understand and to see more and more. It's like there's something totally abhorrent in the idea of somebody who destroys and tears down, or even just leaves the institution. Well, so like one example that quickly comes to my mind is the Desert Fathers in 4th century church, who, when Christianity became tolerated with Rome, they weren't very impressed with the idea, so they went and became ascetics in the desert. Like, let's go as far away from this as possible. But it's like, after they did that for a while, there's like they understood, like, you know what, the spirit.
Oh, you're breaking up a little bit. Hey, you broke up a little bit on me there, so just back up a couple sentences.
Anyway, yeah, I don't know where I broke up.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, so the Desert Fathers, they flee away from the church as it's becoming institutional, as it's becoming a part of Rome. But then, like, they come back as old men. It's like, you know what? All of this spiritual progress that we've made, we need to put that back into the institution.
Yeah.
So this is how it becomes that, you know, what like monasticism in Christianity starts out as kind of like a protest and a rejection of the institutionalization of the church, but then it becomes an institution in itself. Like it's like, you know what, this actually, we need to be a part of the church.
Well, and also along with that, it also begins as hermits and not as communities at all.
Well, I mean, sort of. There were both, actually, at the beginning. There were definitely a lot more hermits, but there were also some small sort of communities that popped up.
Yeah.
At the very beginning. But anyway, I guess I bring up, I see more and more as being abhorrent in the idea of, rejecting the institution or reforming the institution or breaking it down, or both the idea of revolution and reformation. Like the Reformation is a controversial thing to criticize, because it's like, well, what do you do when an institution becomes corrupt? Shouldn't you try to reform it? Well, it's like, well, no, actually, because you can't.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. And I used the word redemption before. What we're doing is we're redeeming these institutions or these systems. And I guess there is something a little uncomfortable about saying we're reforming them. I mean, even when it comes to, like I mentioned, schools before, and it comes to, like, well, in my role as a teacher, am I trying to reform the education institutions? And in some sense, I feel like, well, there are some big glaring problems. It would be nice to bring about some reform. But I don't know. I mean, for me, it's hard to speak. I don't feel like my mission operates on that large of a sphere of influence.
Right.
I'm not trying to change the whole system. I'm just I'm trying to okay, here's what I have. Here are the rules that I'm operating in. How can I be the very best that I can be within this system, which is an act of redemption rather than reformation. But I don't know. I mean, there is something that makes me uncomfortable when somebody's going to propose something like education reform. And I guess it's because that's, I mean, you can call that person a revolutionary or reformation or reformer or whatever, but that person feels like he's got the master plan. He has everything figured out, and the institution before, nobody had anything figured out. So there's a kind of rational arrogance, I guess, in it.
Yeah. So like bringing that back to Revelations. Okay, so who's the one that does all of the fixing of the problems in the book of Revelation? Like, who does it? So you have the elders, the 24 elders. You have the 144,000 chosen. You have the righteous. You have, all of these good figures. But the thing that characterizes all of them is that none of them are revolutionaries. None of them are reformers. None of them are trying to fix things. Instead, what they're trying to do is be righteous.
Mm-hmm.
And the one that comes and fixes things is Christ.
Yeah.
And it's like that. I think I see that as being the pattern that Revelation is trying to show you. That look, you shouldn't be the one trying to fix things, because if you're the one that's trying to fix things, you're one of these servants of the beast.
Yeah.
That's what you are. And you're going to share in the condemnation of the beast.
Well, that's sort of what I said about, there's a rational arrogance in it. I mean, that's the same as saying you're one of the servants of the beast.
Right. Yeah. It's exactly the same.
Now, the only thing that I would want to question on your comment you made there is just that if Christ is the one who's making the change, we are imitators of Christ. And so, how does that play into this idea that it's not us? I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, I don't know. That is a good question.
I mean, even though like it feels right to me, anyways. I don't know if people listening will have the same sort of skepticism of the attitude of a reformer. But to me, it feels like there's something right in it. But it also feels like, okay, so if I'm going to be like Christ in this world, doesn't that mean I'm going to come in and fix the problems?
Yeah, I think, I don't know. I guess I would think of that as a pretty Protestant mindset.
Yeah, right. No, I think so. I mean, but again, I think imitation of Christ and like the idea of becoming like Christ, I think is very important in a way that Protestants also are missing. So I mean, I'm just trying to figure out. I'm like I say, I'm not exactly saying that you're wrong. I'm just saying like how does this all fit together?
Maybe the answer to that question is like, okay, but realize everything that Christ went through before he did that.
Mm-hmm.
Like before Christ returns to set things right, he first came to the earth, like lowered himself as low as he could possibly lower himself, to become man.
Yeah, right.
And then had nothing while he was a man, even though he was the creator of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And just served with humility, and then died, was murdered.
Yeah.
But then also after that was resurrected, and then ascended into heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if you're going to be like Christ, and you think part of that means setting things right, it's like, okay, there's all of these other steps that you have to go through first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think also when it comes to, and again, I'll just use education reform as an example. If you have somebody who comes in with a bunch of new ideas about how to do things, then I'm just going to speak not in terms of what's necessarily right or wrong, but what people will perceive as being right or wrong, and maybe they're correct in their perceptions. But if somebody comes in and says, hey, I've got a bunch of changes I'm going to make, it is very important to other people that person was a teacher and still identifies as a teacher, even though they're in a different role right now. Again, I'm speaking education reform in particular, but you get somebody who's going to change things on the big level. Well, in addition to being on the big level, you had also better be on the lowest level.
Yeah. Which is something like, there was a lot of criticism for Donald Trump for putting in an education secretary that had no background in education.
Mm-hmm.
And there's all kinds of defense of that. So I'm not going to take a position on the right or left, either one. I'm just using this to illustrate the point. So the idea on the right is, well, it's like she's a businesswoman and she needs to run this as a business. And then there's this objection, but she has no background in education, which
mm-hmm.
is an accurate objection to have.
Yeah, right.
In any industry,
I guess part of the point that I'm really making, and I was very clear, I was talking about people's perceptions,
right.
But I think really the heart of what I'm saying is sort of this question of identity. You need to be one of the people. Identity is a hard word because you can say, well, I identify as being one of the lowly ones. I identify as being a member of the working class or whatever, and it's like, well, that identity is a dangerous word just because you can. It's like such an easy word to use when you're just blowing smoke or whatever.
Yeah. So,
but that person needs to have a major part of their being needs to really abide in that lowest level.
Mm-hmm. Right. Which is this idea, Christ becomes a man and is tempted in all points as we are, and also you have this this idea through the genealogies of Christ, how, like, I really like this idea that there's a reason the writers of the Gospels, like Matthew and Luke, I think are the two that give us genealogy. Is that correct?
I think so, yeah.
But they spell out the details differently, and also, like, they leave people out and include people. So to make, they include and exclude certain people to make a point, and that point is basically, directed at the context of the culture that they're writing to show you, like, look, all of the problems, all of the things that are wrong with your world, Christ has that in his lineage. Like, he's fully involved in all of the bad things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is inseparable from his nature.
Yeah.
In the incarnation, and it's like, that's, like, this is all kind of higher up, more mystical language, bringing it down on a practical level. Okay, so what's that mean? Well, so like your situation in teaching reform, it's like, well, like you said, like, your reformer, well, not your reformer, but your figure, like, in order to be at the top, you need to kind of be the lowest of the low.
Mm-hmm. Well, and say, to get out of a conventional mystical framework, then we'll say, like, you're going to look towards some musician as being a type of spiritual guide in your life. Then it's like, it's important to you that there's some rough edges to that person. If they've had some, like, criminal background or something like that, like, that in a way makes them more legitimate. And I was thinking of, like, on the this must have been on the Ken Burns country music documentary. Johnny Cash's daughter made some comment about Johnny Cash was never in prison, but when he was playing concerts in the prisons, you wouldn't have been able to convince anybody there that was true. They all believed that he was one of them. Mm-hmm. And I mean, he did have personal problems. I mean, in some ways he wasn't as far removed from them as what a lot of people are, but there's still this sense that if the person is really going to be up on a pedestal, if they're really going to be making waves in the world, then they must be one of the lowly ones. And yeah, I mean, music in general works that way. Like, it's actually really astonishing to me. Like, if you look back through music history and you see, like, how many of the people that really, and especially modern music history, I guess, but you look back at, like, how many of the people that really revolutionized music, how many of them came from money? It's very, very few of them. How many of them came from poverty? It's like, it's almost all of them. Even though a lot more rich people have learned and played music than what poor people have, but it's like the important people must be lowly people.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to point out, like, we're not saying those people are like Christ, but, like, at the same time, there's still.
Well, I think they are bringing about something in the world that the world needs.
Yeah, well, what I was trying to say is we're not saying that they're like Christ.
No, and I wouldn't.
Christ. Well, but there's a sense in that they are showing a part of the pattern.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's what I mean when I say they're bringing the world something that the world needs.
But no, like, I think, and this is something I find to be a pretty frequent pattern among the mystical writers of early Christianity, which, remember, like, all of these guys that I'm talking about were, for the most part, pretty much all of them were persecuted by the church for saying the things that they did.
Mm-hmm.
But every last one of them takes, like, a really, really strong stance against the idea that you should try to fix the church, or you should try to reform the church, or you should try to cleanse the church of all of its errors, or you should try to, set forth perfect dogma, and all of these things.
Right.
I think like there's definitely a strong ethic in early Christianity that like you avoid at all costs anything that basically pretty much anything that causes the problem.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, this is an interesting line to take on this idea of the reformer, but partly because it. I know I'm getting a little off topic of where you were headed, but it puts humility as the highest virtue, which I think is the case anyways. I mean, like from a spiritual standpoint, I think you cannot grow without without humility, but you can't grow without death to self. Without releasing something that you hold dear, and so, I mean, like you can have a lot of sins, and you can beg for forgiveness, but you can't be like proud and arrogant and beg for forgiveness. Like you have to be humble. Like there's no growth without humility. So I do consider it, and I think this is actually very Mennonite, but I do consider it like, well, I don't know, it's sort of very Catholic too, as far as the theology of it goes. But I mean, in terms of like just the way that Mennonites feel about things, that humility is sort of the ultimate that you aspire to.
Well, I mean, that's also like definitely the early Christian mindset that like everything, like humility is at the center and at the root of everything.
Yeah.
Like anything that you have, if you don't have it in humility, becomes a curse. Like anything that's a blessing without humility is a curse.
Yeah, right.
And going back to Isaac the Syrian, like I said, I was listening to him earlier, listened to a recording of one of his books earlier. Another thing he said, like on the idea of knowledge and somebody that has knowledge, is like, okay, first of all, he says, he has this idea, anybody who is eager to dispute the truth doesn't have the truth. But then also, like, if you are wise, if you do have the truth, if somebody wants to dispute with you, for their sake, don't say anything.
Yeah.
And like presenting this idea, like.
Oh, are you there?
Yeah, sorry, I was pausing to gather my thoughts.
Okay.
You don't like it when I do that.
Well, I mean, it's a little hard to tell on the phone, but you were breaking up a little bit a while ago, and I thought, I finally lost him.
Yeah, no, where was I? You threw me off my train of thought.
Yeah, well, this phone conversation, no, actually it's been very good, I think, but it's hard. We don't get to interrupt each other as often when we're on the phone because I don't know. That's one thing I've noticed about this talk.
Anyway,
you were talking about don't dispute the person.
Yeah.
Well, they wanted to dispute the truth, and you remained silent.
Right. I can't remember what I was going to say.
I don't know. You're going to tie it to humility, maybe?
Huh?
You're tying it to humility, perhaps?
I was, but I can't remember I lost my...
Yeah.
My thought completely.
Okay. Well, we had talked about doing maybe a shorter talk, maybe half an hour or so, and we've been going for over an hour now. So we want to wrap this up before too long. I think there was actually a lot more to this conversation than what I thought there was going to be when we were planning it beforehand.
Yeah, I'm not riding my horse anymore, by the way.
No, I can tell, actually, because I do hear it every now and then when you're on it. Not constantly, but yeah, I hope you had a nice ride. I had a nice walk around the baseball field. And then actually there's a church on the other side of the baseball field. They got stations at the cross there that I walk through there sometimes. And I guess I didn't really go through the whole stations, but I was going through part of it for the conversation anyway.
Yeah, I feel like I wanted to say something more on on the idea of, the rebel or the, and people like to try to cast Christ as a rebel or as a reformer.
Mm-hmm. Right.
He's the opposite of either one of those things. I guess this does kind of tie back to what I was saying about, thinking that you hold the truth, thinking that you're a bearer of the truth and wanting to spread the truth, wanting to dispute, wanting to prove, and that probably being an evidence that you don't hold to the truth. Because, he also brings, I find it a really fascinating idea, and it's, I've been running around in my mind and trying to deal with it, because, there's part of me that wants to disagree with it. But this idea that, those that are, wrapped up in disputations and wanting to prove their point and wanting to show what they think is right, they're far from the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And when you come to the truth, the actual I guess sort of behavior you'll have is you'll be quiet, you'll be humble, you're going to be so eager to speak.
Yeah.
Which I like. There's a sense in which that just makes perfect sense, but I can't quite put together why.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing it makes me think of is just you can look around, you can see the current of ideas in the world, or maybe there's maybe you're just watching the news all the time, or you're seeing the state of politics or whatever, and you think, man, this world is just falling apart. And actually, most of the normal people are just fine,
Right.
and they're just minding their own business. They're not crazy, but they're not vocal about being normal human beings with normal human values.
Right.
There's a kind of silence, and just this keeping to themselves. And
but I don't think that's quite the same.
No, but the contrast is the people that have a platform and have fame and are saying all these crazy things, all the stuff that's crazy in the world is coming from the ambitious people.
Yeah. Well, there's definitely I don't quite get so much of the side of it, why it makes sense to me that the person who holds the truth, is just going to be quiet and humble,
Mm-hmm.
and peaceful, and not go out and try to share it and speak it and all those things.
Yeah.
The other side of it is the other side of it is perfectly obvious. I think anybody that I can think of that's really vocal about an idea, and really out there trying to prove their point, you look at them and think you don't believe this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You're just
right.
trying. You're trying to convince yourself. And I don't know. I'm trying to be less critical of. I probably won't go there. I'm intentionally trying to be less critical of certain groups of people in certain branches of Christianity and things like that. I was tempted to bring out here's what this group does.
Well, it's tough because again you have the same thing that I was just describing, where you have some leaders in these churches that they've tried to nail positions down in a certain way, and blah blah blah. The whole church seems to be corrupt and terrible and evil, but really a lot of the people that within that church are they're just fine.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because concept in my mind that the situation that we're in as a church right now is so dissimilar from what the church was like in the 4th century.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an understanding in the 4th century, there's a lot of sectarianism, there's a lot of division. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different sects within the church. But then there's still this understanding that, there's still just one church.
Yeah, right.
And, I think of, I have this idea, this kind of concept in my head that all of these different denominations that exist, like you can think of them as people, and like what they all are is they're all rebels, they're all reformers, like they're all people that are trying to fix the church in their own way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, like none of them are the church.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've been using education reform as an example, but since I'm kind of in this, like, I shouldn't say church hopping state in life. I mean, we moved to a new area, and we've been looking around at a few different churches, trying to figure out where we want to go. There's a difficulty in it because wherever you go, you see problems, things that you don't like about it. And if it was a church that you were already devoted to, you would see those problems, but you would say, I still accept this and I still love it, even though it has problems.
Right.
I don't know. I guess I'm again just sort of processing that in relation to this idea of the institutions have problems. I felt like this was more related to your comment, I guess, than what it really is. But I mean, like what you want to do is go in there and not necessarily reform it or change it, and also not go out and somewhere magically find a perfect church, but you just go in there and you just be the best person that you can be, and in doing that, like, you redeem the thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, because it's like the other side of it is like, okay, what hope is there? Like, again, going back to the idea of the institutions, like Christ redeems the institutions.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, well, like, what hope is there? What hope is there for Jerusalem if all of God's people just abandon her?
Yeah, right. Well, and what hope is there for the church? Or again, like, to go back to education, this was on my mind earlier in the conversation, and I didn't mention it.
Like, I'm using Jerusalem as like a symbol.
It's all those things. Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's a symbol. It's a universal symbol.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think it's used in the scripture.
So you go back to things like schools, and again, you have lots of good people who say, and actually myself included, even though I'm in a public school right now, like, there are lots of good people who say, like, I would just rather not be there. I just dislike the system so much that I want a job anywhere else. And it's like the worse things get, the more that the good people want to pull away and not be involved in it. And every kind of system,
so, like,
every
I'll
kind of
say,
institution is that way. And so it's like,
Yeah,
in politics too, I mean, if we've talked about that before, if you decide politics is for bad people and all politicians are corrupt and I'm not going to go into it, it's like, okay, well, that's one less good person, and that means that chair is open for one more bad person. So, like, the world's getting worse when you decide that institutions are bad, so you're not going to take part in them.
What you have is it's a very, very, like, an extremely modern concept. And it's also, like, I would characterize it. Sorry for those of you that have gone through this thought process and made decisions like this, but it's an extraordinarily selfish way of looking at the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is.
Like,
and I started when
what you're saying is, I'm the center of my own world.
Yeah. Well,
I'm the
that's
most important thing in my world. And so, like, anything that violates me, I need to get away from it. I need to get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, no, like, you're supposed to lay down your life and die for the world. Like, that's what it means to be like Christ.
Yeah, that's why when I started describing, like, how does the righteous person deal with the institution, my first example was, okay, picture an old guy who's near the end of his life and he's thinking about, what is my legacy going to be? Just because that's like the definition of somebody who's not thinking about himself. Like, I started with that example because that rules out selfishness altogether. And you see, okay, how does a selfish person behave in the institution? Well, he tries to be the best he can be, and he tries to help that institution do good to other people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the selfish person just he can't be satisfied with it enough in order for it to do good to other people.
Right, and so, like, this is what like we create in the modern world with the church is, and like the Protestants certainly start, is that well, like there's no good in the system. So I'll need to go and make my own system.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we do need to call it quits pretty soon. So.
Yeah, I actually have stuff I need to.
Okay.
To do.
Yeah, I think. I mean, good thoughts. I enjoyed the conversation. I don't know if you have any last words you wanna hit anything one more time, or just any closing thoughts.
No, not really.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think I'll be satisfied with it there too. Maybe I'll just reference your image of New Jerusalem one more time, and this idea that this isn't just the description of the end times, but it's like
Right.
this is how we live our lives. We bring about that New Jerusalem.
Yeah, like if you like to tie it back to what we've been talking about with the institutions, it's like if you're willing to stick it out, and like if the righteous people are willing to stick it out and not try to fix things, then I think that's actually the answer. That's what enables God to work.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, nice. Okay, we'll just call it a night. And thanks to everyone who's listening.